In the shadow of England's most prestigious estates, where ancient secrets whisper through manicured gardens and family loyalty battles against hidden betrayals, one explosive moment would shatter the careful facade of the powerful Ashford family forever. When Lord William Ashford discovered his stepmother's trusted aide secretly filming his beloved daughter Charlotte in the estate's private gardens, his thunderous confrontation would expose a web of surveillance, jealousy, and manipulation that threatened to destroy everything the family had built over generations. What started as a peaceful afternoon in their ancestral home would become the catalyst for revelations that would rock the very foundations of British high society. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling grounds of Ashford Manor, its golden rays illuminating the dew-covered roses that lined the estate's famous garden paths. Charlotte Ashford, a spirited 12-year-old, with her father's determined chin and her late mother's gentle eyes, skipped along the cobblestone walkway, her school uniform slightly rumpled from the morning's adventures. The estate, which had been home to the Ashford family for over 3 centuries, stood majestically against the backdrop of rolling English countryside, its limestone walls holding secrets that spanned generations. Charlotte had always found solace in the gardens, especially since her mother's passing 2 years prior. The carefully maintained hedgerows and blooming flower beds provided a sanctuary where she could escape the complexities of her father's remarriage and the constant presence of staff who seemed to watch her every move. Today, however, she was unaware that she was being observed more closely than usual. Lord William Ashford, heir to one of Britain's most influential families, had married Lady Catherine Pemberton 18 months after his beloved first wife's tragic death in a car accident. The union had been met with mixed reactions from society circles, particularly given Catherine's reputation as a calculating socialite who had previously been linked to several wealthy widowers. While William believed he was providing Charlotte with a mother figure and himself with companionship during his grief, many observers questioned Catherine's true motives. Catherine's assistant, Margaret Whitmore, had been by her side for nearly a decade. A sharp-featured woman in her early 40s, Margaret possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate her employer's needs and desires, often before Catherine herself was aware of them. Her loyalty was absolute, her discretion legendary among the social elite, and her methods sometimes questionable. She had accompanied Catherine into her new role as Lady of Ashford Manor, where she quickly established herself as an influential presence among the household staff. On this particular Tuesday morning, Charlotte was practicing her violin in the garden pavilion, a charming stone structure that her great-grandfather had built for outdoor musical performances. The pavilion was positioned strategically to take advantage of the garden's natural acoustics, surrounded by climbing roses and jasmine that created a fragrant, secluded atmosphere. Charlotte's music teacher had assigned her a challenging piece by Vivaldi, and she preferred practicing outdoors where the notes seemed to dance with the breeze. Margaret had been observing Charlotte's routine for several weeks, noting the precise times when the young girl sought solitude in various parts of the estate. She had convinced herself that she was merely being thorough in her duties, ensuring that Charlotte's whereabouts were always known for security purposes. However, her true motivation ran deeper, rooted in Catherine's growing concern about Charlotte's influence over William and her potential impact on Catherine's own position within the family hierarchy. The relationship between Catherine and Charlotte had been strained from the beginning. Despite Catherine's public displays of affection and her carefully crafted image as a devoted stepmother, private moments revealed a different reality. Charlotte, intelligent beyond her years, sensed the artificiality in Catherine's behavior and maintained a polite but distant relationship with her stepmother. This dynamic frustrated Catherine, who had expected to win over the child through a combination of gifts and attention. William, consumed by his duties managing the family's vast business interests and his grief over his first wife's death, often missed the subtle tensions brewing within his household. He trusted Catherine's judgment regarding household matters and was grateful for her apparent dedication to Charlotte's well-being. His busy schedule frequently took him to London for board meetings and social obligations, leaving the day-to-day operations of the estate in Catherine's capable hands. The estate itself was a sprawling property encompassing over 2,000 acres of farmland, forests, and meticulously maintained gardens. The main house, built in the Georgian style with later Victorian additions, contained 43 rooms, including a grand ballroom that had hosted royalty and prime ministers over the decades. The staff quarters, located in a separate wing, housed 12 full-time employees who maintained the property and attended to the family's needs. Charlotte's daily routine was well established and carefully structured. Mornings were dedicated to private tutoring in the estate's converted library, where she studied under the guidance of Miss Adelaide Harrington, a Cambridge-educated governess who had been selected personally by William. Afternoons were reserved for music practice, French conversation with Madame Dubois, and outdoor activities that allowed Charlotte to explore the extensive grounds under the watchful eye of security personnel. The garden where Charlotte now practiced had been designed by Capability Brown in the 18th century and had been lovingly maintained by successive generations of the Ashford family. The central feature was a serpentine lake that reflected the changing sky throughout the day, surrounded by ancient oak trees and carefully planned vistas that created the illusion of endless rolling countryside. Hidden pathways wound through thickets of rhododendron and azalea, creating secret spaces where one could disappear from view entirely. Margaret positioned herself behind a massive oak tree approximately 50 yards from the pavilion, equipped with a small, professional-grade camera that Catherine had purchased under the pretense of documenting Charlotte's progress for William's benefit. The camera's telephoto lens allowed Margaret to capture detailed images without being detected, and its silent mode ensured that her presence would remain unnoticed even by Charlotte's acute hearing. As Charlotte drew her bow across the violin strings, producing a haunting melody that seemed to echo through the garden, Margaret began systematically photographing her movements. Each frame captured intimate moments of concentration, frustration, and joy as the young girl worked through the challenging musical passage. The images would later be reviewed by Catherine, who claimed she was monitoring Charlotte's emotional well-being and social development. The morning progressed peacefully, with Charlotte completely absorbed in her practice session. She had inherited her mother's musical talent and her father's perfectionist tendencies, a combination that drove her to spend hours refining her technique. The Vivaldi piece required precise finger positioning and breath control, skills that she was still developing under her instructor's patient guidance. Unknown to both Charlotte and Margaret, William had returned early from his London meetings due to a cancelled appointment with potential investors. His driver had deposited him at the main entrance, and he had entered through the front hall, greeting the household staff with his characteristic warmth and inquiring about Charlotte's whereabouts. Mrs. Henderson, the longtime housekeeper, informed him that Charlotte was practicing in the garden pavilion as usual. William's relationship with his daughter had deepened considerably since his wife's death. He recognized that Charlotte had assumed responsibilities beyond her years, often attempting to comfort him during his darkest moments of grief. Her resilience and maturity impressed him, but he also worried that she was missing crucial aspects of childhood due to the family's circumstances. The violin lessons represented one of many efforts to ensure that Charlotte maintained connections to beauty and creativity despite the challenges she had faced. As William made his way toward the garden, his footsteps silent on the grass pathway, he reflected on the changes that had transformed their household since Catherine's arrival. While he appreciated Catherine's organizational skills and her efforts to restore social activities to the estate, he sometimes felt that Charlotte had become more reserved and distant. He attributed this change to normal adjustment difficulties and trusted that time would heal any underlying tensions. The garden path William chose led him directly past the oak tree where Margaret had concealed herself, though her position was angled away from the main walkway. The sound of Charlotte's violin guided him forward, and he smiled as he recognized the challenging piece she was attempting to master. His own mother had been an accomplished musician, and he looked forward to surprising Charlotte with his early return and perhaps listening to her practice session. Margaret, completely focused on her surveillance activities, failed to notice William's approach until his shadow fell across her field of vision. She had been adjusting the camera's settings to capture better detail of Charlotte's facial expressions when she suddenly became aware of a presence behind her. Her heart rate accelerated as she realized that her covert operation had been discovered, but she initially assumed it was merely another staff member who could be easily dismissed with an authoritative explanation. When she turned to face the intruder, however, her blood ran cold as she recognized William's tall frame and distinctly aristocratic bearing. His expression, which she had only ever seen displaying politeness or mild amusement during social gatherings, now showed a combination of confusion and growing anger that made her stomach lurch with dread. In that moment, Margaret realized that her carefully planned surveillance had been exposed in the worst possible way. William's initial confusion quickly transformed into cold fury as he processed the scene before him. His stepmother's assistant, equipped with professional photography equipment, had been secretly documenting his daughter's private moments in what should have been a safe, secure environment. The violation of Charlotte's privacy and the breach of trust within his own household triggered a response that surprised even him with its intensity. The peaceful garden morning was about to become the epicenter of a confrontation that would forever change the dynamics of the Ashford family, setting in motion events that would expose hidden agendas and test the very foundations of loyalty, trust, and family bonds that had sustained the estate for generations. The silence that followed William's discovery of Margaret stretched like a taut wire between them, filled with the distant sound of Charlotte's violin and the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. William's eyes, normally warm and welcoming, had transformed into steel-grey orbs that seemed to pierce through Margaret's carefully constructed facade of innocence. She clutched the camera against her chest, her mind racing through possible explanations that might salvage the situation, but each potential excuse crumbled under the weight of the obvious evidence. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" William's voice was low and controlled, but Margaret could detect the dangerous undercurrent of rage that threatened to explode at any moment. His aristocratic bearing, usually displayed through gracious hospitality and gentle manners, now radiated an authority that reminded everyone within earshot why the Ashford family had maintained their position of power for centuries. Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. "Lord Ashford, I can explain," she stammered, her usual confidence completely evaporated. "Lady Catherine asked me to document Charlotte's progress for your review. She thought you might enjoy seeing how well Charlotte is developing her musical abilities while you're away on business." The explanation sounded hollow even to Margaret's own ears, and William's expression darkened further as he processed what she was telling him. Catherine had never mentioned any such arrangement, and the clandestine nature of Margaret's activities contradicted any innocent intent. Moreover, William found it deeply disturbing that his wife would authorize surveillance of his daughter without discussing it with him first. "Progress documentation?" William's voice rose slightly, though he remained conscious of Charlotte's proximity. "You're hiding behind trees photographing my 12-year-old daughter without her knowledge or consent. This is surveillance, not documentation, and you damn well know it." The profanity, though mild, was completely out of character for William in front of staff members. His loss of composure indicated just how deeply Margaret's actions had affected him. Throughout his life, he had prided himself on maintaining appropriate boundaries and treating household employees with dignity and respect, but this situation had crossed every conceivable line of acceptable behavior. Margaret's face flushed red as she realized her initial explanation had only made matters worse. She could see in William's eyes that he was connecting dots she had hoped would remain separate, understanding implications that she had never intended him to discover. Her years of loyal service to Catherine had never prepared her for a direct confrontation with the head of the household, especially under such compromising circumstances. "Sir, please understand that my intentions were entirely innocent." Margaret tried again, her voice gaining a slight tremor. "I would never do anything to harm Charlotte. She's a lovely child, and I only wanted to help Lady Catherine understand her better. Sometimes Catherine feels that Charlotte doesn't trust her completely, and she thought these observations might help her connect with her stepdaughter more effectively." This second explanation struck William as even more concerning than the first. The idea that Catherine was studying Charlotte's behavior patterns and emotional responses through covert surveillance suggested a level of manipulation and calculation that chilled him to the bone. He began to question everything he thought he knew about his second wife's motivations and methods. "Where is Catherine now?" William demanded, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "I want to speak with her immediately about this arrangement you claim she authorized." Margaret's heart sank as she realized she was about to expose Catherine to William's wrath. "She's in the morning room reviewing seating arrangements for the charity luncheon next week," Margaret replied reluctantly. "But perhaps we could discuss this matter privately first. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding that we can resolve without involving Lady Catherine unnecessarily." William's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. "The only misunderstanding here is your apparent belief that you could spy on my daughter in my own garden without consequences. You're going to march yourself to that morning room right now, and you're going to explain to Catherine exactly what I discovered you doing. Then we're all going to have a very frank discussion about boundaries, privacy, and respect." The authority in William's voice made it clear that argument would be futile. Margaret nodded miserably and began walking toward the house, the camera still clutched in her trembling hands. William fell into step beside her, his presence looming like a storm cloud ready to unleash its full fury. The walk across the garden felt endless, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that Margaret knew would forever alter her position within the household. Charlotte's violin music continued to drift across the garden as they walked, the innocent beauty of her practice session creating a stark contrast to the ugly situation that was unfolding nearby. William glanced back toward the pavilion where his daughter remained blissfully unaware of the drama surrounding her, and his resolve hardened even further. Charlotte had endured enough upheaval in her young life without having to worry about being watched and analyzed by people she should be able to trust. The morning room of Ashford Manor was Catherine's personal domain, decorated in soft pastels and filled with fresh flowers that were replaced daily by the gardening staff. She had claimed the space shortly after her marriage to William, transforming it from a seldom-used sitting area into her private office where she managed social calendars, charitable obligations, and household affairs. The room's large windows overlooked the estate's formal gardens, providing a perfect view of the areas where Charlotte typically spent her outdoor time. Catherine was seated at an antique writing desk, several invitation cards spread before her as she carefully considered the placement of various society figures at the upcoming charity event. The luncheon was intended to raise funds for a local children's hospital, and Catherine had thrown herself into the planning with characteristic attention to detail. She viewed these social gatherings as opportunities to solidify her position within the community's elite circles and to demonstrate her worthiness as the new Lady Ashford. The sound of approaching footsteps caused Catherine to look up from her work, and her face immediately registered alarm as she saw Margaret's distressed expression and William's thunderous demeanor. She rose gracefully from her chair, her social training automatically engaging to help her navigate whatever crisis was about to unfold. "William, darling, what a wonderful surprise," Catherine said with practiced warmth, though her eyes remained fixed on Margaret's face, searching for clues about what had gone wrong. "I wasn't expecting you back until this evening. I hope your meetings went well?" "My meetings were cancelled," William replied curtly, making no move to accept Catherine's offered greeting, which turned out to be quite fortuitous, since it allowed me to discover your assistant hiding behind trees in our garden, photographing our daughter with professional equipment. Catherine's face went pale as the implications of William's words sank in. She had expected Margaret to be more discreet in her surveillance activities, and the discovery of their arrangement represented a catastrophic failure that could potentially destroy everything Catherine had worked to build within the family structure. "I think there must be some misunderstanding," Catherine began carefully, her mind racing through possible responses that might minimize the damage. "Perhaps Margaret was simply—" "There's no misunderstanding," William interrupted sharply. "Margaret has already admitted that you authorized her to spy on Charlotte. What I want to know is why my wife thinks it's appropriate to conduct surveillance on my 12-year-old daughter without my knowledge or consent." The confrontation was about to explode into full view, with years of hidden tensions and carefully concealed motivations finally forcing their way into the light. Catherine realized that her carefully constructed image as a devoted stepmother was about to be thoroughly examined, and she wasn't certain it would survive the scrutiny. Margaret stood frozen between the two most powerful people in her world, knowing that her future depended entirely on the outcome of the next few minutes. The camera in her hands felt like evidence of a crime, and she began to understand that her years of loyal service to Catherine might not be enough to protect her from the consequences of this morning's discovery. The morning room, usually a sanctuary of calm efficiency, had become a battlefield where family loyalties, personal ambitions, and protective instincts were about to collide with explosive force. Catherine's mind raced through a dozen potential responses as she faced her husband's accusatory stare, each option seeming more inadequate than the last. Her years of navigating high society's treacherous waters had taught her to remain composed under pressure, but nothing had prepared her for this particular crisis. The carefully constructed foundation of her marriage to William was crumbling beneath her feet, and she knew that her next words could determine whether she could salvage her position or face complete exile from the life she had fought so hard to achieve.
"William, please sit down and let me explain properly," Catherine said, gesturing toward the comfortable armchairs arranged near the window.
Her voice carried the smoothness of practiced diplomacy, but her hands trembled slightly as she moved to pour tea from the service that was always kept ready in her morning room. "I can see how this situation might appear concerning, but I assure you that everything Margaret has been doing was motivated by genuine concern for Charlotte's well-being." William remained standing, his posture rigid, with barely contained anger. "Concern for Charlotte's well-being?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You had my daughter photographed secretly while she practiced violin in what should be the safety of her own garden. How exactly does violating her privacy serve her well-being?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, still clutching the camera that had become the centerpiece of the unfolding drama. She had expected Catherine to handle the situation with her usual grace and persuasive charm, but even Catherine's considerable social skills seemed inadequate to address the magnitude of William's fury. The assistant began to realize that she might become a sacrificial offering in Catherine's attempt to preserve her marriage. "You must understand the position I've been placed in," Catherine continued, her composure beginning to show cracks around the edges. "Charlotte has been resistant to developing a relationship with me. Despite my best efforts to connect with her, to show her affection and support, she maintains a distance that makes it impossible for me to fulfill my role as her stepmother effectively." William's eyes narrowed as he processed Catherine's words. So you decided that the solution was to spy on her, to study her behavior like she's some kind of specimen to be analyzed and manipulated? The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and Catherine realized that her carefully planned explanation was having the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of generating sympathy for her position, she was inadvertently confirming William's worst suspicions about her motivations and methods. "That's not how it was intended," Catherine protested, her voice rising slightly in frustration. "I simply wanted to understand Charlotte better, to find ways to reach her that might be more effective than my previous attempts. Margaret has experience with children from her previous positions, and I thought her observations might provide insights that could help me become a better mother figure for Charlotte." William's laugh was sharp and bitter. "A better mother figure? Catherine, Charlotte's mother died 2 years ago. She was an extraordinary woman who loved Charlotte unconditionally and treated her with respect and dignity. The idea that you think you can replace that through surveillance and manipulation is both insulting and deeply disturbing." The mention of William's first wife struck Catherine like a physical blow. She had always known that she was competing with a ghost, that William's memories of his perfect first marriage cast a shadow over everything in their current relationship. However, hearing him explicitly contrast her methods with his deceased wife's approach made her realize just how poorly she compared in his estimation. "I never presumed to replace Charlotte's mother," Catherine replied, her voice now carrying a defensive edge. "But I am her stepmother, and I have responsibilities toward her whether she chooses to acknowledge them or not. I've tried everything I could think of to build a relationship with her, gifts, special outings, involving her in social events, but nothing seems to work. She's polite but distant, affectionate but reserved. How else was I supposed to understand what she needs?" Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Perhaps I could explain my observations to Lord Ashford. I've been watching Charlotte for several weeks now, and I believe I've gained some valuable insights into her personality and preferences that might be helpful." Both William and Catherine turned to stare at Margaret with expressions of incredulous horror. The assistant's suggestion that she had been conducting extended surveillance on Charlotte was precisely the wrong thing to say at that particular moment, and her words only served to deepen William's rage and Catherine's embarrassment. "You've been watching my daughter for weeks?" William's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Without my knowledge, without her consent, you've been studying her behavior patterns and documenting her private moments for weeks." Margaret's face went ashen as she realized her mistake. "I meant that I've been observing her daily routine to ensure her safety and well-being," she stammered. "Nothing inappropriate, just general awareness of her activities and emotional state." "General awareness?" William exploded, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. "You've been conducting psychological surveillance on a 12-year-old child. Do you have any idea how completely unacceptable that is? Do you understand the violation of trust and privacy that represents?" The sound of William's raised voice carried through the morning room's open windows, drifting across the garden where Charlotte was still practicing her violin. She paused mid-note, her bow suspended above the strings, as she listened to the distant sounds of angry voices coming from the house. Although she couldn't make out specific words, the tone was unmistakable, and she felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Catherine realized that the situation was spiraling completely beyond her control. "William, please lower your voice," she pleaded. "Charlotte will hear you, and she doesn't need to be upset by this discussion. Whatever mistakes may have been made, we can resolve them privately without involving her in adult conflicts." "Charlotte is already involved," William shot back. "She's the victim here. She's been living under surveillance in her own home, being watched and analyzed by people she should be able to trust. How do you think she's going to feel when she learns that her privacy has been violated so thoroughly?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. None of them had fully considered how Charlotte would react to learning about the surveillance, and the prospect of explaining the situation to her filled them all with dread. Charlotte was intelligent and perceptive beyond her years, and she would undoubtedly understand the implications of what had been happening. Catherine sank into one of the armchairs, her social armor finally cracking to reveal the desperation beneath. "I never intended for things to go this far," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I was just so frustrated, so desperate to find a way to connect with her. She's important to you, which makes her important to me, but nothing I tried seemed to work. Margaret suggested that understanding her better might help me approach her more effectively." William studied his wife's face, searching for signs of genuine remorse or merely calculated self-preservation. "So this was Margaret's idea?" he asked, his gaze shifting to the assistant who was still standing frozen in the doorway. Margaret's loyalty to Catherine warred with her instinct for self-preservation. "I may have suggested observational techniques," she admitted reluctantly, "but Lady Catherine made the decision to proceed. I was simply following her instructions and trying to be helpful." The careful deflection of responsibility created a new tension between Catherine and Margaret, their previously solid alliance beginning to fracture under pressure. Catherine shot a sharp look at her assistant, realizing that Margaret was positioning herself to escape the worst consequences by shifting blame back to her employer. "I see," William said coldly. "So we have a conspiracy of convenience." Catherine wanted intelligence about Charlotte, and Margaret was willing to provide it through whatever means necessary. The question now is what we're going to do about this situation. The morning that had begun so peacefully was transforming into a watershed moment that would forever alter the relationships within the Ashford household. Charlotte's violin had fallen silent, and somewhere in the distance the sound of her footsteps could be heard crossing the garden as she made her way back toward the house, unaware that her world was about to change dramatically. The sound of Charlotte's approaching footsteps created an immediate urgency in the morning room that transformed the confrontation from a heated argument into a crisis requiring immediate damage control. William's paternal instincts overrode his anger as he realized that his daughter was about to walk into the middle of a situation that could traumatize her permanently if handled poorly. Catherine and Margaret also recognized the gravity of the moment, understanding that Charlotte's reaction to learning about the surveillance could determine the future of all their relationships. "She's coming back," Catherine whispered urgently, rising from her chair and moving toward the window that overlooked the garden path. "William, we need to decide how to handle this before she gets here. We can't let her discover what's been happening in a way that will hurt her unnecessarily." William's mind raced through the possible approaches, each option presenting its own set of risks and complications. He could attempt to shield Charlotte from the truth entirely, but his daughter was too intelligent and perceptive to be easily deceived. Alternatively, he could tell her everything immediately, but the shock and betrayal she would feel might damage her ability to trust anyone in the household ever again. "Margaret, give me that camera," William commanded, extending his hand with unmistakable authority. "I want to see exactly what you've been documenting before Charlotte arrives." Margaret hesitated for a moment, knowing that the contents of the camera would provide irrefutable evidence of the scope and intimacy of her surveillance activities. However, William's expression made it clear that refusal was not an option. With trembling hands, she surrendered the device and watched helplessly as William began scrolling through the digital images. The photos revealed a level of detailed observation that was far more invasive than either Catherine or Margaret had admitted. There were close-up shots of Charlotte's facial expressions during moments of concentration, frustration, and joy. Images captured her private gestures and unconscious habits, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, how she bit her lower lip when she was struggling with a difficult musical passage, the satisfied smile that crossed her face when she successfully mastered a challenging sequence. "My God," William breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "These aren't documentation photos. These are intimate portraits of a child who believes she was alone and unobserved. You've stolen moments of privacy that she'll never get back." Catherine moved closer to look at the camera's display, and her face paled as she saw the images through William's eyes. What Margaret had presented to her as simple observational documentation now appeared as something far more invasive and inappropriate. The close-up nature of many photos and the obvious use of telephoto lenses created an impression of stalking rather than casual observation. "I didn't realize she had been so thorough," Catherine admitted, her voice carrying genuine shock and dismay. "Margaret, you told me you were simply noting Charlotte's general activities and mood patterns. These photos suggest something much more intensive than what we discussed." Margaret felt the foundations of her defense crumbling as both William and Catherine turned their disapproval towards her. "I thought detailed documentation would be more helpful," she protested weakly. "How else could I provide you with meaningful insights into Charlotte's personality and emotional needs?" "By talking to her!" William exploded, his patience finally exhausted completely. "By spending time with her, showing interest in her activities, asking her questions about her thoughts and feelings. You know, the way normal human beings build relationships, instead of conducting covert psychological research." The front door of the manor opened with its characteristic creak, and Charlotte's voice could be heard greeting Mrs. Devon. Henderson in the entrance hall. The sound of her cheerful conversation with the housekeeper provided a stark contrast to the tension that filled the morning room, reminding all three adults of Charlotte's innocence and the magnitude of the betrayal they were discussing. "She'll be here any moment," Catherine said urgently. "William, what do you want to do? How do you want to handle this?" William closed his eyes for a moment. struggling to balance his protective instincts with his commitment to honesty and transparency. Charlotte had already experienced enough deception and loss in her young life, and he was determined not to add to her burden through additional lies or manipulation. "We're going to tell her the truth," he decided, his voice carrying quiet resolution. "Not all at once, and not in a way that's designed to hurt her. But she deserves to know what's been happening. She's lived through her mother's death, our marriage, and now this. She's strong enough to handle the truth. And she's smart enough to figure it out anyway if we try to hide it." Catherine's face showed a mixture of respect and terror at William's decision. "What if she can't forgive me?" she asked quietly. "What if this destroys any chance I might have had to build a real relationship with her?" "Then that's a consequence you'll have to live with," William replied bluntly. "But hiding the truth from her would guarantee that you could never have a genuine relationship with her. At least this way, there's a possibility for honest communication and eventual forgiveness." Charlotte's footsteps could now be heard in the corridor leading to the morning room. Her violin case bumped gently against the wall as she navigated the narrow hallway, and her humming indicated that her practice session had left her in good spirits. The irony of her happiness was not lost on the three adults who were about to deliver news that would fundamentally change her understanding of her home and family. Margaret made one final attempt to salvage her position. "Perhaps I should leave you to speak with Charlotte privately," she suggested, edging toward the door. "This is really a family matter, and my presence might make things more difficult." "You're not going anywhere," William said firmly. "You're going to explain to Charlotte exactly what you've been doing and why you thought it was appropriate. She deserves to hear the truth from everyone involved, not just sanitized versions designed to protect people's reputations." The footsteps stopped just outside the morning room door, and Charlotte's voice called out cheerfully, "Father? Mrs. Henderson said you came home early. Are you in there?" William took a deep breath and exchanged glances with Catherine and Margaret, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the future relationships within their household. "Yes, Charlotte, I'm here," he called back. "Please come in. We need to have a family discussion." Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her face bright with pleasure at seeing her father unexpectedly. She was still carrying her violin case and had removed her outdoor shoes, her stocking feet silent on the morning room's Persian carpet. Her expression showed curiosity rather than concern, and her obvious trust and affection for everyone in the room made what was about to happen even more difficult to bear. "What's wrong?" Charlotte asked immediately, her perceptive nature detecting the tension in the room despite everyone's attempts to appear normal. "Has something happened? You all look quite serious." William moved toward his daughter, his heart breaking as he prepared to shatter her sense of security in her own home. "Charlotte, please sit down," he said gently, gesturing toward the sofa. "There's something we need to discuss with you, something that's been happening without your knowledge." Charlotte sat down her violin case and perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap and her attention focused completely on her father's face. She had learned to read his expressions during the difficult months following her mother's death, and she could see that whatever he was about to tell her was both important and unpleasant. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no way to soften the impact of what Charlotte was about to learn about the people she had trusted with her safety and privacy. Charlotte's eyes moved from person to person in the room, her intelligent gaze taking in the subtle signs of distress that each adult was trying unsuccessfully to hide. Catherine's usual perfect posture had given way to nervous fidgeting with her jewelry. Margaret stood rigidly near the doorway as if prepared to flee at any moment, and her father's face carried the same expression of barely controlled emotion that she remembered from the days immediately following her mother's funeral. The combination of these observations filled Charlotte with a growing sense of dread, though she maintained her composure with the remarkable maturity that had become her hallmark. "Father, you're frightening me a bit," Charlotte said softly, her voice carrying both trust and trepidation. "Whatever this is about, I'd rather know immediately than sit here trying to guess what's wrong." William knelt beside the sofa so that he was at eye level with his daughter, his hands gently taking hers in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "Charlotte, what I'm about to tell you is going to upset you, and I want you to know that your feelings about this situation, whatever they may be, are completely valid and important." Charlotte nodded solemnly, her grip tightening on her father's hands as she prepared herself for whatever revelation was coming. Her experiences with loss and family upheaval had taught her that life could change dramatically without warning, and she had developed an inner strength that allowed her to face difficult truths with remarkable grace. For the past several weeks, William continued, choosing his words carefully. Margaret has been photographing you during your daily activities without your knowledge or consent. She was doing this on Catherine's instructions, and they've been studying these images to try to understand your behavior and emotions." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Charlotte's face went through a rapid series of expressions as she processed the information. Initial confusion gave way to understanding, which then transformed into hurt, and finally settled into a kind of quiet anger that was far more intimidating than any emotional outburst would have been. "You've been watching me?" Charlotte asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was learning. "Photographing me when I thought I was alone?" Margaret stepped forward hesitantly, her professional composure completely abandoned. "Charlotte, I want you to understand that nothing inappropriate happened. I was simply observing your daily routine to help Lady Catherine understand how to connect with you better. The photographs were meant to document your interests and activities." Charlotte turned her attention to Margaret with a directness that made the assistant visibly uncomfortable. "May I see these photographs?" she asked, her tone polite but implacable. William hesitated for a moment, then handed Charlotte the camera. "You have every right to see what was taken," he said quietly. "But please remember that you don't have to look at everything if it becomes too upsetting." Charlotte took the camera with steady hands and began scrolling through the images with methodical precision. Her face remained expressionless as she viewed photo after photo of herself in what she had believed were private moments. The close-up shots of her facial expressions, the detailed documentation of her unconscious gestures, the intimate portraits of her emotional responses to her music, all of it represented a violation of privacy that was far more extensive than anything she could have imagined. "These aren't just documentation," Charlotte observed with chilling calm. "These are surveillance photos. Someone was studying me like I'm some kind of specimen." Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Charlotte, I know this seems terrible, but my intentions were never malicious. I've been struggling to find ways to connect with you, and I thought if I understood your personality better, I might be able to be a better stepmother to you." Charlotte looked up from the camera, her gaze meeting Catherine's with an intensity that was simultaneously mature and heartbreaking. "You wanted to understand me better?" she asked quietly. "Did you ever consider simply asking me questions? Did you think about spending time with me doing activities I enjoy? Did it occur to you that treating me like a normal human being might be more effective than spying on me?" The simplicity of Charlotte's questions exposed the fundamental flaw in Catherine's approach with devastating clarity. Every suggestion Charlotte made represented obvious alternatives that Catherine had either overlooked or dismissed in favor of more manipulative methods. The contrast between Charlotte's straightforward thinking and Catherine's complicated schemes highlighted just how misguided the surveillance operation had been. "I tried those approaches," Catherine protested weakly. "You were always polite but distant. I felt like I was failing in my role as your stepmother, and I was desperate to find something that would work." Charlotte's laugh was bitter and far too sophisticated for someone her age. "You felt like you were failing?" she repeated. "So you decided that violating my privacy was an acceptable solution? How did you imagine I would react when I inevitably discovered what you were doing?" The question revealed another critical flaw in Catherine's planning. She had been so focused on gathering information about Charlotte that she had never seriously considered how Charlotte would feel about being surveilled, or what the long-term consequences might be when the truth inevitably came to light. William watched the exchange between his daughter and his wife with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Charlotte's maturity and emotional intelligence were remarkable, but he also recognized that she was being forced to handle adult-level betrayals and disappointments that no child should have to face. Her strength in this moment was impressive, but it was also a stark reminder of how much she had already endured in her young life. "Charlotte," William said gently, "I want you to know that I had absolutely no knowledge of what was happening. If I had known about any of this, I would have stopped it immediately." Charlotte nodded, her trust in her father remaining intact despite the chaos surrounding them. "I believe you, Father," she said simply. "But I'm not sure what happens now. How am I supposed to feel safe in my own home, knowing that people are watching me and taking pictures without my knowledge?" The question struck at the heart of the matter, exposing the fundamental damage that had been done to Charlotte's sense of security and privacy. Trust, once broken, could not be easily repaired, especially when it involved such intimate violations of personal space and autonomy. Margaret made another attempt at damage control, though her position was clearly hopeless. "Charlotte, I want you to know that I never meant any harm. I was trying to be helpful, and I'm deeply sorry that my actions have upset you so much." Charlotte studied Margaret's face for a long moment before responding. "Mrs. Whitmore, you spent weeks watching me, photographing me, studying my most private moments without my consent. Whether you meant harm or not, you've made it impossible for me to ever trust you again. I'll always wonder if you're watching me, analyzing me, reporting on me to someone else." The finality in Charlotte's voice made it clear that Margaret's position in the household was no longer tenable. Trust was the foundation of all relationships within the estate, and once that foundation was destroyed, there was no realistic possibility of rebuilding it. Catherine realized that her own relationship with Charlotte had probably been damaged beyond repair as well. "Charlotte, is there anything I can do to make this right?" she asked desperately. "Any way I can prove to you that I'm truly sorry, and that nothing like this will ever happen again?" Charlotte considered the question seriously, her mature approach to problem-solving evident even in this emotionally charged situation. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "Trust isn't something you can just apologize for and fix. You'll have to prove over time that you've changed. And even then, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to forget that you thought spying on me was acceptable." William stood and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where this crisis had begun. "Charlotte, what would you like to happen now?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of family leadership. "What do you need from us to begin feeling safe in your own home again?" Charlotte took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before responding. "I want Mrs. Whitmore to leave," she said clearly. "I can't live in the same house with someone who violated my privacy so completely. And I want all the photographs deleted immediately, in front of me, so I know they're gone forever." Margaret's face crumpled as she realized that her years of service to the family were ending in disgrace and dismissal. "Charlotte, please reconsider," she pleaded. "I've worked for this family for years. This is my livelihood, my career." Charlotte's expression remained unmoved by Margaret's appeal. "You should have considered those consequences before you decided to spy on a 12-year-old child," she replied with devastating simplicity. The morning room fell silent except for the sound of birds singing in the garden outside, a cheerful counterpoint to the solemn atmosphere that had settled over the assembled family. William realized that his daughter's strength and wisdom in handling this crisis had probably saved their family from even worse consequences, but he also understood that the relationships within their household would never be the same again. The camera was returned to William, who immediately began deleting the photographs while Charlotte watched to ensure that every image was destroyed. Each deleted photo represented a small step toward restoring Charlotte's privacy, but the emotional damage caused by their existence could not be erased so easily. As the last photograph disappeared from the camera's memory, Charlotte stood and faced the three adults who had shaped this crisis through their actions and decisions. "I need some time to think about all of this," she announced with quiet dignity. "Father, I'd like to have dinner with you tonight, just the two of us. We have things to discuss." With that pronouncement, Charlotte picked up her violin case and walked from the room, leaving behind three adults who were forced to confront the consequences of their choices and the remarkable strength of the child they had so seriously underestimated. The morning that had begun with hidden surveillance and secret agendas had ended with truth, accountability, and the clear understanding that Charlotte Ashford was far more capable of protecting herself than anyone had realized. The Ashford estate would continue to function, but the relationships within it had been fundamentally and permanently altered by the events of this single, transformative day.